Hello, this is Mr. Wartsky. Today we are going to start classification and wrap up evolution. Now, classification is just the evolutionary history of an animal or an organism. So we're going to introduce you first that says fossil record shows us that the diversity of organisms on this that populate the planet Earth is a result of three different paths. That was rough. In phylogeny, our goal is to trace the evolutionary history of each species, and we will classify organisms based on that evolutionary history. So, what are the three paths? We can have a phyletic change in directional selection. One species becomes another species. So, A, over a period of time, eventually becomes B. In cladogenesis is the splitting of lineages. New species are formed by a common ancestor. And you have the common ancestor here, common ancestor here, where you have branch points. Now the common ancestor between A and B is here. The common ancestor between A, B, and C is here. Same thing here. Common ancestor here, common ancestor here. Cladogenesis. The third is adaptive radiation, when you have sudden diversification of a group of organisms from a common ancestor. So the pattern it occurs radially out from the center, just like Darwin's finches. You had a parent population and over time became 13 different populations of finches. A phylogenetic tree, what is that? Well, from the paths that we just discussed, we can create, that's create, an evolutionary or phylogenetic tree. That's create, not create. This tree shows us common ancestry, relative divergence from a common ancestor, and the evolutionary relationships between living species. In a phylogenetic tree, you start off with a common ancestor, and new species branch off from that common ancestor. So we have a phylogenetic tree here between A and B. The most recent common ancestor of A and B is here. The most recent common ancestor of A, B, C, and D is here. Okay, so ancestors move to the present day species, and we can see that there is one natural selection event, two natural selection events, three, and four. So each time you have a branch, that's when natural selection and speciation happen. The new population are exposed to new environmental conditions. You have natural selection, you have speciation, and the formation of a new species, which I just said. Populations with recent common ancestors are more closely related evolutionarily. Those two species will have similar DNA sequences and they should have homologous structures. The structures will look the same or similar, but will have different functions due to different environmental conditions. We're tying things together. Now, we need to organize things. That's what we do, and we like to group things together and put them in their place. We need a system that does this and shows evolutionary relationships. A person by the name of Carl Linnaeus, his noble name was Carl von Linn. His Latinized name was Carolus Linnaeus. He lived from 1701 to 1778 and he developed the classification system, the one that we use today. He developed a series of categories, starting with the largest, which contain the most organisms, to the smallest, which contain one type of organism or one species. We'll go from largest to smallest. And there's a picture of Linnaeus or Carl von Linn, his noble name. Linnaeus, he used Latin for his method of classification. Why? Because Latin is a dead language. Yeah, right about that. And since it's a dead language, it won't be used, and therefore it will not change. In addition, Latin is the basis or root of many of our languages. You might be asking, what are his categories? Now, his categories are kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Kingdom is the largest and contains the most, and species is the smallest. It contains one type of organism. Now today we have added another category because that's what we do, and that category is domain, and it is actually the largest of the categories. So it goes on top of kingdom. So it should read domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. That's not genius, but it's genus and species. How do you remember these things? Well, comes up with some type of device. Take the first letter of each one and you make a new word. So, did goes for domain, king for kingdom, Philip for phylum, come for class, over for order, for family, great for genus, and spaghetti for species. So it says, did King Philip come over for great spaghetti? That is one way to remember the order of categories. So if you take a look at these three organisms, we go from domain all the way down to species, which organisms are more closely related evolutionarily? Take a look. And if you said that gorilla and Homo sapiens, you'd be actually correct. This right here is a dog, Canis lupus familiaris, gorilla, or Homo sapiens. How do you know? Because they share the most categories. So we refer to organisms by two of the 9 categories. The genus, which is capitalized, and the species, which is lowercase. They are underlined or they're italicized. So Homo sapiens, which is our genus and species, is our scientific name. We can write H. sapiens. Each category can have a super, which is above, and sub below. So you can have a superclass, class, subclass, superfamily, family, subfamily, super kingdom, kingdom, subkingdom. So every division has its own super and sub. So now the goal of taxonomy is to sort out closely related organisms, to name new species, and to show evolutionary history. Phylogeny is the evolutionary history of a species or group of related species. Systematics is the science of classification with the use of taxonomies. Evolutionary systematics is the study of evolutionary relationships, and taxonomy is the study of a species. Now we're going to take all of that and we're going to put it together in how we classify organisms. We're going to talk about phylogeny, the systematics, as well as the taxonomy of those organisms every single time we classify one of them. We want the taxonomy of a species to reflect the phylogeny of the species. And from the taxonomy, we can create a diagram, a phylogenetic tree, that shows the evolutionary history of a species. Now, those diagrams are also called cladograms. The cladogram or phylogenetic tree are a series of branches or dichotomies. Each branch represents divergence from a common ancestor due to natural selection because of different environmental conditions. That's also speciation. So each branching point can also represent a different category, the one that we've gone over from domain all the way down to species. And a cladogram shows one common ancestor is monophyletic. And here is a cladogram. We have the order, the family, the genus, and the species. Notice when there's a different, we have a branching point. Now each branching point represents natural selection and speciation. Well, that changed quick. So a dichotomous key is a way to identify organisms based on physical characteristics with a series of yes or no questions and go-to statements. Now, each question is a branching point of the cladogram. We can show evolutionary history with cladograms, taxonomies, and dichotomous keys. We should be able to discuss how these three relate and what a branch point represents. Now, we're going to practice this in class. You'll probably be sick of it pretty soon, but we're going to practice it anyway. So a dichotomous key talks series of questions with yes, no answers. And each key represents a cladogram. So does it have dry skin? No, that means it has moist skin as a salamander. If it does has dry skin, that means we have these organisms. Hair? Well, no, lizards don't have hair, but these organisms do. Opposable thumbs? Well, no, tigers do not, but these two do. Bipedal, two legs? No, they walk on fours. And the Hue individual that is biped. Now, each one represents a different category too. And each branch point right there represents natural selection and a common ancestor. So how do we classify organisms? There are two schools, not the universities or anything. You can't go to the University of Phonetics or University of Cladistics, CU. No. So phonetics and cladistics. Now, phonetics is based on observable characteristics. Each characteristic is divided into unit characteristics. They're assigned a value. A computer compares the values and then gives you the evolutionary history of the organism. We don't use that. Instead, we have cladistics, which is based on phylogeny, which is evolutionary history. This is constructed based on evolutionary history. We need to take a look at homologous and analogous structures. We also need to take a look at DNA. So how do we do this? Well, first, we assign an organism to a taxon based on its appearance. So if it looks like a duck, it's going to be classified as a duck initially. You test the different species that look similarly for homologies, use fossil evidence if possible, then you compare DNA whenever possible. The tools is first is homology, look at similar structures, and you have to determine if the similar structures are homologous due to a common ancestor or if they're analogous with no common ancestor. DNA is the big one. You take a look to see if the DNA is similar, if the proteins are similar, nucleic acid hybridization to see if the DNA matches up, to see if it's similar. You do restriction maps. Now, molecular clocks show when species diverge. So if we can determine the rate in which mutations occur, and if they occur regularly, then we can determine when a species diverges. Now remember, this is a rough estimate. This is not specific at all. Molecular clocks are sometimes unreliable. So in the beginning of classification, there were two kingdoms. You were either a plant or an animal. Then three kingdoms, plants, animals, and protists. Today we have five kingdoms, Moneron, Protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. In addition, we have added three domains or cell types. Now, the first type, Eubacteria and Archaebacteria, are both bacteria, whereas Eukarya are eukaryotes. Eukarya account for Protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. And that is it for the notes. If you have any questions, please watch the video over again, read your textbook, or ask me in class tomorrow. Have a good night.